Friends, do you remember fireworks? Last year they were canceled. This year here in Boston, they're back, but not quite the same. The Boston Pops will be playing, but out in Tanglewood to only a small audience, while the fireworks will be going off, not in their home location along the Esplanade, where just recently we gathered to baptize Iggy, but on the Boston Common. I hope someone asked Liz Visa about this in advance. In an effort, I assume, to keep the crowds down in light of COVID. Music and fireworks apart. Today's 4th of July seems a bit dislocated too. And as I ponder this image, I'm increasingly convinced it fits our overall societal mood quite well this year. We're all still a bit dislocated. Now, this morning's service began with our weekly ritual of grounding ourselves in God's grace. And we do this as a people of faith regularly, acknowledging that each week, each day, we swim in the sea of forces that often run counter to the beauty and truth of God's intent. We encounter pain, fear, denial, and so we crave grounding in the promise of God's unending grace. Today is perhaps one of the longest prayers for such grace that we have said, grounding ourselves with some troubling, incredible, famously fierce words from none other than the activist, abolitionist, anti-racist St. Frederick Douglass, as pictured on our bulletin this morning. This now famous speech given in Rochester, New York in 1852 to a group of abolitionists, what to the slave is the 4th of July, made ripples then and still does now. Douglass gave this speech on the 5th of July in an act of protest, refusing to celebrate on the 4th while slavery remained the law of the land. To the great orator, the 4th of July was but a sham, a mockery, and a deception, a day that reveals more than any other day of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which people of color are the constant victim. And all prayers, hymns, and sermons linked as bombast and hypocrisy. And these are hard words for those of us gathered right now in prayer, in hymn singing, and sermon giving. It strikes me about this cutting discourse how directly it calls out the American church, implicated in upholding slavery's grip through active participation and passive silence. The sins of omission as well as the sins of commission. Oh, be warned, Douglass writes. The white church at that time had all the data and power it needed to abolish slavery, but shamefully failed to do so. Why? A blindness to its horrors, an unwillingness to get political, a fear of unseating the nation's main economy, an inability to see racism and slavery as contradictions to the very gospel message they claimed to proclaim. And he wished, of course, a fire, a thunder, a storm, a whirlwind, an earthquake to rouse the conscience of the church and the nation, to wake up into its own hypocrisy and move beyond such sin. I wonder how Douglass's speech lands for you today, on this 4th of July Sunday, some 169 years on. In the face of the ongoing shackles we know all too well, COVID's disproportionate impact on people of color, unresolved police brutality against beloved black bodies, Boston's sinful wealth gap of $8 median net worth for black households and $250,000 for white households. Do the biting words of Douglass ring as prophetically relevant this week in the light of white supremacy's rise as voting rights fall, even with the highest court in our land dismantling the Voting Rights Act once again? In the light of the shooting deaths of two veterans of color, David Green and Ramona Cooper, here in Winthrop in an apparent hate crime? Or in the light of anti-Semitism's disturbing rise, here in our own city in Brighton this week, Rabbi Shlomo Naginsky stabbed in the middle of the day outside of the Sholol House, a Jewish day school, in what also looks clearly like a hate crime. Douglass' words resonate and unsettle the blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. And like the church of that day, we don't have the excuse of not having the data to know that such imbalance is wrong. Given America's ongoing original sins of racism and indigenous erasure, on this so-called Independence Day, how might we reframe anew the Douglasian question, what to a Christian is the 4th of July? Now, having no interest in plunging into a church and state relational examination and being clear that a slave and Christian is no equal interchangeable exchange, any more than oppressor and oppressed would be, I posit for us this question and hope it unsettles and even provokes us a bit. For it stands to help elucidate a tension we may or may not recognize, the clash of Jesus and empire. Yes, of course, language is limited and labels fall short. And many of us who seek to follow the renegade, compassionate Jesus, rabbi, may even reject self-identification with the term Christian in the first place. And for many, for good reasons. But putting that aside for the moment and assuming we can all see ourselves in this question, what is the celebration of national independence to us as lovers of communal liberation, striving to live into the footsteps of Jesus, Julian, Frederick, Fannie Lou, Dorothy, Berta, Harvey, Greta? Perhaps more of us, even much more comfortable self-identifying as Christian anarchists under the comfortable umbrella of liberation theology. Can such a faith fit under the roof of empire? And it is not my intent in this inquiry to deconstruct or dismantle every shred of progressive patriotism that may linger with you when mixed with fireworks and the Boston Pops. Maybe just a little bit. In another speech given in 1847 in New York City entitled Love of God, Love of Man, Love of Country, Frederick Douglass states, "No, I make no pretension to patriotism. So long as my voice can be heard on this or on the other side of the Atlantic, I will uphold America to the lightning scorn of moral indignation. In doing this, I shall feel myself discharging the duty of a true patriot, for he is a lover of his country who rebukes and does not excuse its sins." What to a Christian is the 4th of July? A sham? A lamentation? An oxymoron? A call to repentance? As a Christian, I find it increasingly difficult to celebrate the skewed mythology of this country this year. A mythology that favors unexamined stars and stripes and American exceptionalism over and above the hard truths that too often get swept under the rug, like the massacres at Tulsa and Wounded Knee, residential schools not just in Canada, but here in our country that snatched Native children from the arms of their parents, the current crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and their connection to the oil pipeline, so-called man camps, and the very story of Juneteenth and why it took 156 years to finally become federally recognized. By the way, thank you, President Biden. If injustice to some is injustice to all, if we are not free until all are free, can we really relish in independence? In talking to you, Jerry Owen, one of our beloved Jewish members of this congregation this week in the wake of the attack in Brighton, I began to see more clearly what Douglass decries as the immeasurable distances between us here in this country. In addition to feeling shocked and shaken by this hatred here in our front yard, Jerry spoke of an ongoing, underlying fear that she holds as a Jew that in my religious privilege, I've never felt. On a regular basis, not just in wake of such visual acts of anti-Semitism, Jerry shared that she physically, when she is gathered in her Tree of Life synagogue, when someone comes in who is new to the mix, what fills her mind is not the wonder of a new face and a potential new member in that community, but a fear and a questioning. Who is this person? What's their intent? Do they mean any harm to our community? Friends, the sustained ongoing trauma and fear for our siblings in faith in 2021 is real and hinders independence for all of us. And this is something all of us need to be more aware of, more unsettled by. So WWRT, what would our rabbi think of the 4th of July? Mark's gospel is a great landing place for us to ponder such a question. Our disregarded in his own hometown prophet finds himself once again amazed at the unbelieving dismissal of those closest to him. Is this not the carpenter, the child of Mary? They self-righteously mutter. Jesus' kin can't conceive of transformation. They lack imagination. They see possibility as suspect. Surely, the ordinary carpenter can't do anything extraordinary. And so they not only dismiss Jesus, but they take offense at him. The term in Greek here is they were scandalized by Jesus. And Jesus, in turn, is perplexed and amazed by their reaction. And as a result, his power to heal is hampered. Their lack of faith leads to his powerlessness. Their inability to see possibility keeps them and others from wholeness and hope. This, friends, is the true scandal. Now, as Christians, perhaps at least skeptical of the state of our nation, we must not fall into the same trap. Even under the crush of injustices, we must not give up hope. Even Douglas admits at the end of his speech that he does not despair of this country. Even he holds out hope for the American potential. Notice the response of Jesus to this sudden experience of powerlessness. He does not despair, but presses on. And so he turns from his biological family and town of origin to his chosen family and to new horizons. He goes in community to other villages with the message of liberation. And he invites his closest friends to buddy up in pairs and sends them out to be his accomplices in the work of dismantling oppression. Or as the text says, dealing with unclean spirits. Friends, in probing the depths of the state of this land, it's easy to feel despair. But one tool we are called to remember is the power of together. In a recent Boston Globe editorial, Renee Loth writes about the trouble with independence, saying a radical autonomy has turned America into a country with less pluribus and more unum, with fewer bridges and more ramparts. 15 months of semi-isolation due to the pandemic, we may have hardened us further into our personal bunkers. But if we forget how much we need each other, we all lose. She makes the point that sociologists have been making about the growing detachment among Americans from communitarian institutions like church, union halls, bowling leagues, and associated drops in civic engagement, which leads to a lack of truth and trust in one another. Humility and recognition of our mutual dependence is what she claims is needed more than ever this 4th of July. Before a dose of self-righteousness rises within us and says, hey, we're the ones here in church, let's remember the direct call that Jesus asks. He does not remain in his house of worship, the safety of his synagogue, after he gets dismissed, but he goes out into surrounding villages, into the unknown, and summons community. We too must not come together only in common spaces that we know well, but go out together into new horizons with God's message of love. We must do so while we travel lightly. We're asked to grab just some sandals and a staff and one tunic, not two. No bread, no bag, no money in our belts. Intentionally going without our very basic needs. No extra water bottle, no GPS smartphone, no booking ahead an Airbnb in advance, but stepping out in faith, trusting in the hospitality of strangers we've not yet met. Now, if this invitation is not a direct challenge to what is often labeled as American self-reliance and don't tread on me autonomy, I don't know what is. So what is, to the Christian, the 4th of July? Perhaps it's a call to action. A day we are reminded to go out as couples to be cared for by others. A day to celebrate the spirituality of mutuality. If we, like the paired disciples, slow down and simply and simply be, we may see some examples of such mutuality bubbling up around us right now, even in the face of the grave injustices that abound. In response to Rabbi Nijinsky's stabbing this week, like many, I reached out to some of my Jewish neighbors, friends, fellow congregants, and clergy, most with the inadequately simple but heartfelt message that we too are horrified and sorry for this hatred, and we see you and your people and long to stand in solidarity. In connecting with Jerry's rabbi, Liza Stern, and asking if there's anything we as a church can visually do, like vigiling together at their Cambridge synagogue, she surprised me with grace and said, "Thank you. I will pass along your church's welcome message of solidarity to my community, but let's plan on getting together for celebrations, and let's refuse to let hatred darken our shared path." Let's refuse to let hatred darken our shared path. Friends, there is such power in that statement. Going in pairs across difference, mutual aid, simple words of support in solidarity. I also felt this power in pairs this past week in taking part in an action against Enbridge, that massive fossil fuel company that is behind some of the immoral and destructive climate changing projects right now across our own landscape. The West Roxbury Lateral Pipeline here in Boston, the Weymouth Compressor Station in Barbara's beloved hometown, Line 5 in what we call Michigan, and Line 3 in what is known as northern Minnesota. Native land to the Ojibwe and Anasabi. Motivated by their love of this land, folks in that place have been camped out not for weeks, but for years now, some 3 years, in direct opposition to the unlawful and immoral pipeline that's pumping dirty tar sands from Canada down into Wisconsin, across wild rice sacred waters in that place. And they're calling, like they did at Standing Rock, for others around Turtle Island to follow, to buddy up, and to stand and act in solidarity. Listening to that call on Tuesday and Wednesday in the midst of that somehow appropriate climate-changing heat wave, a group of 60 of us occupied their national headquarters at Enbridge, which conveniently is here in Waltham, and occupied the inside and outside for the next 30 hours. In the end, 3 were arrested, and after 13 spent the night inside their offices. And while there is real fear for those taking such direct action, the feeling of a buddy by your side and the songs and chants accompanied by drums and tubas and incredible art and creativity reduces that anxiety, quells the fear. It was so refreshing for me to finally sing together with other human beings face to face without screens. It was the first time in 15 months, and it felt very appropriate to do so in protest, in loving non-violence. I think Jesus also sent people in pairs as a form of accountability, because it's much harder to throw in the towel when you know someone is there by your side relying on you. One of my tricks at Camp Wilmot, when a camper was facing the very real anxieties of homesickness, was to invite them into a simple job. Hey, can you take my watch and be sure to remind me each day when it's time for us to ring the bell for meals? When that camper knew that they were being relied on by me, it was a little harder for them to think of leaving for home early. Friends, we need the accountability that calls us into mutuality. I was so moved to be part of that movement against Enbridge, and I know again and again people are doing this across our landscape, and I pray that this would continue. Just as Douglas prayed once for freedom for 20 years, but received no answer until he prayed with his legs. He acted in hope and therefore found freedom. Friends, what to a Christian, what to a person of faith is the 4th of July? The spirituality of mutuality. This is a day not to lift independence, but interdependence. As we hear fireworks tonight. Let us remember we are knit together. Let us remember the buddy system. Let us remember mutual aid. And in that, let us indeed celebrate. Bring on the Tchaikovsky. Happy Interdependence Day.